to bring in Bryan Munson of Husker Online, part of the On3 network. Bryan, of course, down in Texas, was at the All-American Bowl kind of pre-week practices, the games being played, of course, on Saturday. 3 Husker commits in this game. Bryan, first of all, how are you? Second of all, how is the Alamo Dome for football? I think of it as a basketball arena. Does it still work for football?
Happy New Year, man. Yeah, no, it works for football. Actually, they had a couple of the upper sections kind of closed off. I don't think they typically get the type of attendance that they to kind of fill the upper deck of the Alamo Dome. But it brought back memories. The first time I went there was to watch Ndamukong Suh and Marlon Lucky and Philip Dillard and Craig Roark and all those guys. And I think that was the same year that Deshaun Jackson decided to try to take flight from the 5-yard line and kind of came up just about a half yard short. Dude, that guy was in the air for, it seemed like 5 seconds. And I think he was really just tearing the game apart, honestly. But no, it's still a wonderful venue. They've done some tremendous things to kind of keep that venue up. It's in a wonderful part of San Antonio too. The location can't be beat. And no, it was a really well run practice yesterday.
Would that have been that Nebraska-Michigan Alamo Bowl that you're referencing?
So I was not at that game. I remember watching that game with former Husker Byron Bennett, however, and but no, this was the U.S. Army All-American game back in high school. So like that last year of those guys, so like before they all came to Lincoln, like the very next week with, Dillard and those guys, they were all down in San Antonio. And Ndamukong hadn't committed yet. And I think that there was a defensive back that ended up going to Oklahoma, Reggie Smith, I think is who it was. And he and those guys were still, it was just an amazing kind of thing. Nebraska was Bill Callahan era. They had like 7 guys in the U.S. Army All-American game. And really 3 was a pretty big number, by comparison to other teams that have their commitments there as well this week.
And 3 for Nebraska again. I mean, you mentioned the class that you saw the first time. That was a great class for Nebraska. Some great performances, obviously, from Suh, Lucky, and Dillard. Those guys, with one name. Will we know Nelson, Bricks, and Pyle by one name when they're done? What did you see and hear from those guys down there in your time in San Antonio?
Yeah, man, I tell you what, they started out fast yesterday because I had some great pictures of this too. I just didn't have the really great angles, but the 3 of them, there's a couple of formations they have where Nelson's kind of lined up as a wing back, and right off of, Bricks's hip at right tackle and then to Bricks's inside at right guard is Gibson Pyle. So you get all 3 of those guys like in the same shot. I felt like, well, just so you know, so Grant Bricks did a great interview, and I just put up a story on it, and I'll kind of give you a little bit of a summary of it. He's having to learn on the fly. And I think Carter Nelson, his interview is going to be very similar to that. You have 2 guys that played, not necessarily the highest levels of football based on population or based on, wherever their high school is at. It doesn't really matter. It's like, so Carter comes out of, not even playing 11-man and not having ever blocked somebody before. And essentially now they're running an offense that doesn't even target the tight end in San Antonio. So he's being leaned on to learn how to block. And he said, like, look, I'm here, eyes wide open. I want to see, and I want to learn, how I'm supposed to do this at the next level. This is his first opportunity to block isn't against foes or opponents for Ainsworth. It's at the U.S., the All-American Bowl in San Antonio. And Grant Bricks was very similar. He's like, look, we run wing tee, wishbone, straight ahead, run the ball, run heavy kind of offense. And he said, we don't do a lot of pass pro, and we don't do any zone blocking. It's usually man on man, heads up, and we just drive guys off the football. So it's very much, just kind of get onto a guy and drive him into the ground. And he's having to move a lot laterally now and do some zone blocking. And those are, and there's a lot of technique here that he's having to pick up, like on the fly. Like he said it best. He's like, I'm learning and I'm implementing all at the same time. So those two guys are, and they're not swimming in it by any means. They are really having a chance to kind of pick this thing up, get this really nice experience under their belt before they make it to Nebraska. So they're getting a little glimpse of what their future is going to be like. I mean, look, the Big Ten probably a little bit more closer to the NFL than people ever thought it was, based on the national championship picture and the teams that are competing. And I think people can appreciate that now when I say, these guys are getting a chance now to play against these All-American players, and they're getting this tremendous opportunity to kind of get up to speed and understand speed of the game, not just being the best player on the football field anytime I just walk off the bus. Everybody else on the football field is just as talented as they are. And I think that's been a huge thing for them. And they've been able to go out there and just physically take over a game because of their athleticism, their size, and now all of a sudden technique matters. And you're having to do things like Carter Nelson explained, I'm catching footballs from guys that are throwing it way harder with a lot more revs on it than I've ever seen before. And it's one of those huge adjustments for him, just like hand placement and footwork, it is for Grant Brix. And I think things are still, for Gibson Pyle, I think that there's still an acclimation to the speed and the size and the physicality, of playing in the phone booth of inside linemen. But that's something, that he transitioned to, playing 6A football in Houston. So a little bit closer in terms of competition level, just because of, they're kind of dialing it up a notch, playing inner city Houston kids, but not necessarily Ainsworth and Logan, Iowa. But I mean, still, despite all that, guys, Carter and Grant were getting huge kudos from all the people watching them. Their athleticism is very apparent, and it maybe hides some of these things, these growing pains that they're kind of going through this week. But the one thing that really stands out is just how quickly they're implementing that stuff and how athletic people are.
Bryan, you've seen these three guys. You mentioned that picture, with Nelson at wingback and the two offensive linemen there on the right side of the line. I mean, they're playing in a game as teammates together for the first time. Do you think we see all three of those guys on the field in a game again in 2024, or is 2025 the most likely arrival for that trio?
I think it's 2025, unless you're talking about a game that lines up where all those guys are working through, their 4 redshirt games next year. And I talked to Gibson and I talked to Grant, and I think there will be some open competition, for each of them to kind of go in there, and try to win the spot and try to open up some eyes and try to really be competitive, and get up to speed very, very quickly. That being said, Nebraska had a pretty good offensive line haul the year before, number one. And I think the development has been dialed up a notch, since Matt Rule and his staff, have gotten to Lincoln. I do think that they are starting to appear to maybe over-recruit some of the current roster. This is where you get guys like Pyle and like Grant Brix, but I think that development side is better than what it was before under Mickey Joseph and Scott Frost. So it's really going to be interesting. I think that they want them to be ready as well as they can be. But I mean, Grant Brix, one of the other things he said that he had to improve on, and one of the reasons why he said he decided he needed to get to Lincoln as quickly as possible, is he needs the nutritional side, to add weight. He needs to add size, and he needs to get to work in the weight room. He has got some absolute tree trunks for legs, for being a guy as tall as he is, and for being a guy that just says that he's a little light at 6'5", 295 pounds. He's the kind of guy that's going to cut 10 and put on 25 very, very quickly. So I don't think, though, still that you can really kind of count on any of those guys maybe really kind of stepping up next year. Maybe Brix. I think they're trying to tell Powell to kind of be ready. I think that there might be an interior spot that's going to be up for grabs. I know that they're talking to Powell too about being ready to play center as well potentially. So it's possible, but I think unless you're lining it up on maybe one or two of the other guys, 4 games, redshirt games, I don't think you're going to see them normally on the field together next year.
We're talking with Bryan Munson of Husker Online here on our Allo VIP line. Bryan, elsewhere at the All-American Bowl game is some Nebraska targets, right? A lot of guys that Nebraska was interested in. I see Ryan Wingo, Gatlin Bair, Nathaniel Frazier kind of among that group. Were those guys legitimately interested in Nebraska? Did they just take, polite visits to Lincoln? Or do you think that maybe had Dylan Raiola changed his mind sooner, 1, 2, 3, any of those guys might have, made up their mind to come to Lincoln with him?
It's an interesting question. Gatlin Bair is still undecided. So if there was an influence there or a draw now that Raiola is no longer going to Georgia and he's going to Nebraska, and if Nebraska was really, I think, in that top 2 teams that maybe Bair was considering before he chose Boise State, he'd have an opportunity to kind of back off and reconsider things based on where he's at. I don't believe that Nebraska right now is part of his picture. That being said, I know that Ryan Wingo was a guy that Nebraska was reaching out to. I think there were several other players that Nebraska was reaching out to, like you had mentioned, kind of that 11th hour before signing day. And this is kind of post after maybe some understanding is there, for NIL and, all the other kind of things are already in place. And I think it gets just really difficult in that 11th hour to kind of go back on the things that you've already kind of set up and the look, that's a long-term commitment because Wingo had flipped. But I mean, if you're talking to like a guy like Brandon Baker, that's been that's a longer-term commitment that he has had to Texas. So I do feel like Nebraska could have had some influence on some other guys if say Raiola backed off his commitment like at Halloween. That's possible. But I think with where he did it, it really was more about him kind of watering his own soul and knowing what the right thing was for him versus, I've been, playing the flute and these guys are following me to Georgia and now I can get those guys to follow me to Nebraska. I think it was really more about like he needed to do something for himself. And I know that he had kind of put all that stuff in place in Athens, but there wasn't a way to kind of do it very well for Nebraska based on what the timing of everything was.
Which makes sense. Speaking of timing, Bryan, I want to throw this to you too here real quick, especially from the recruiting side that you cover. We were talking yesterday on the show about bowl season and everything that goes on, especially in a busy month of December into January. With bowl game prep and bowl games, you have the early signing day now in December and the transfer portal window from early December into early January. They're all going on at the same time. Is it an advantage at all for high school, players commits to have that portal window open at the same time, as their early signing day? So coaches, might view those high school players as more of a, plug and play sort of option and not go get someone in the portal? Or would it be better to push the transfer window to after spring, give high school guys their own month and coaches their own month to focus on this high school class of commitments?
Yeah, or you could actually move your high school signing day to like an August or a September. Right. I mean, you knock out 90+% of the guys that are going to go play D1 football by like the end of July. You do get into this very interesting flipping season, from about like the middle of November up to about Sunday. So you get like the last 3 or 4 weeks of where you're kind of seeing that happen. And I'm not saying that you couldn't necessarily see that like maybe through the month of August, like if you decided to do it like the Wednesday after Labor Day or something like that. Yeah, I think that there's some possibilities there that I think that you kind of touched on that I'm kind of feeling to gain relevance back to the bowl game and the bowl and all that good stuff. You do, I think, need to find a better way to get the portal transfers either, out after the bowl season, after the bowl game, make the window open a little bit later. The problem with that, I think, obviously, is that you're in this roster management kind of crunch and you're kind of trying to make that 85 work. And you got, if you had an earlier signing day with the high school guys and you got that out of the way, like in September or in August, and then you had a chance to kind of do your kind of exit interview and understand how, like, where people are, what they're kind of thinking and what they're planning on doing, you could still be very active, I think, in that kind of portal process as you're kind of getting into that January, February timeframe. I think by the time everything has to like happen and people are enrolling and school is starting, if you don't have that time frame there in that month of December, I think it just puts way too much pressure, I think, on the schools and on the players to kind of figure out where they're going to go. I think I do agree that something has got to happen. I don't have the right answer. I think that the NCAA though has really created a mess when it comes to this, just because of the diminished value of the overall bowl games in general.
The NCAA creating a mess? Say it ain't so, Bryan.
I've not been a huge fan of much that they have done recently. I think that there's even more than that, that I'm just not much of a fan of. But I think that they wanted to slide everything left. They wanted to get fast with everything, and I think the whole transfer process is out of control in the first place, with no penalty and no immediate need, and nobody sitting out for a year, and I think that's a little bit out of control. But I think that this whole windows and opportunities and the bowl seasons being a mess, I think they absolutely have to take a look at something, and whether it's the windows or the signing day that gets adjusted, they've got to make some adjustments.
Last one for you real quick, Bryan. Bills by 5, Bills by 10, Bills by 20.
Oh, I hope it's by 20 because my kicker cannot take a 5. I tell you what, I was a little bit surprised to see a -3, although I know Miami is really dinged up, and that's really good news. I think there's 3 different ways that the Bills can make it in. I'm going to go ahead and say Bills by 10. I will take your middle number, and I tell you what, you guys probably will catch me having not ever have slept still next week.
Hey, you know what? If it's after a Bills win, I'm sure you'll take it. I'm rooting for the Colts. Again, I think there's plenty of room for both our teams. Bryan, I'm glad you had a good trip down to San Antonio. Glad you made it back. Thanks for making time for us today. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for having me today. We'll see you.